people like to think that, well, Bill Clinton was a great president and this guy was an altruist because he returned Aristide after 3 years in exile in Washington in 1994. The truth is, you know, I was there. I was really close to this situation. Almost got killed for this story. The truth was that the Haitian military had become the largest drug traffickers on the island. They had overseen the transition from the Medellin cartel to the Cali cartel. And they were the major transshipment point. They turned Haiti into the major transshipment point for cocaine bound for the United States. And remember that the majority of these military officers had been trained in the School of the Americas. The majority, yes, had been trained in the United States. And the majority of them, it later came out, were actually still on the payroll of the Central Intelligence Agency. During the period that they transformed Haiti into the major transshipment point for cocaine bound for the United States, they began to eat themselves alive fighting over the proceeds of the cocaine trafficking. So this institution that had been created by the United States was beginning to destroy itself over those cocaine proceeds. At the same time, there was a huge movement internationally, especially among the religious communities of the world, to return Aristide. Remember that the killing had reached such a level, the carnage had reached such a level that it was impossible to ignore any longer, and that there were, because of that, as a result, there were thousands of refugees fleeing Haiti and ending up in Miami, and it was turning into a huge scandal for the United States government. So, make a long story short, it was not altruism. That was not the real reason behind returning Aristide in 1994. And I think that what the United States military did makes that clear, because they did not disarm the death squads. They did not disarm the former military after Aristide disbanded them. Quite the contrary, they kept them in reserve. They let them keep their arms. And these were the same forces that would later overthrow Aristide a second time.
So Aristide went back to Haiti in when?
94.
94. And when did he become the leader of Haiti? In 94?
No, he first was elected in 1990.
Right.
And then he was overthrown in 1991, September 30th. While he was in exile in Washington, well, this is interesting, because when he was returned in 1994, 20,000 U.S. troops committed by Clinton to, quote-unquote, restore democracy, and I just explained to you why I don't think it was a restoration of democracy. But what was interesting is when Aristide returned, the majority of the electorate that had elected him in 1990, when he returned in 1994, demanded that he be allowed to fulfill those 3 years that he had spent in exile. Their point of view was that he wasn't acting as the president, actually, while he was in Washington in exile. Therefore, those 3 years should be given back to him. Well, it's interesting that the U.S. Embassy and the Clinton administration said, no, while you were in Washington, we treated you like you were the president, therefore you were the president, and those 3 years are lost to you and lost to the Haitian people forever.
Okay. So 1994, what happens? He's back?
He's back.
Who's the president? Or
what? He is.
He's the president again until...
He's restored until his mandate. Remember, they were elected for 5-year terms. He cannot succeed himself, so he can't run for a successive president.
Okay. So his term is up in 1995.
95.
Then
next year.
He's gone.
He's gone, and René Préval
becomes the president from 1995 until 2000.
Until 2000, that's right.
In 2000,
Aristide is re-elected.
That's
right.
So why is Haiti so important to, it seems, the governments of both the United States and Canada, so that at this time, it seems like both countries, Canada and the United States, were complicit in another coup that took place in 2004?
2004.
And removed Aristide again. Why? What's the story behind that?
Well, it's interesting. In the coup, after the coup in 1991, Canada actually played a sort of counterbalance to the U.S. bad guy. They kind of played a good cop, bad cop, where Aristide was concerned. France was also a little more ambivalent. In 2004, it was clear that they were all united in having funded the opposition to Aristide through non-governmental organizations, and having helped to isolate the Aristide government, and the sort of unified sense that the Aristide government had to go. Canada, the United States, and France seemed to be very much on the same page February 29th, 2004. So much so that those three countries already had their military on the ground the moment that Aristide was forced onto a plane by 50 U.S. Marines and flown to the Central African Republic.
Maybe you can just go through that story of what actually happened in those few days, just quickly. I mean, was he kidnapped and removed from the country?
Well, it's interesting because there were these paramilitary forces. We're talking about death squads that had been trained by the Central Intelligence Agency that had been responsible for murder and mayhem after the 1991 coup. I'm speaking of FRAP, the Front for Advancement and Progress in Haiti, very well documented, CIA-created, funded paramilitary death squad. Elements of the former military, who I told you had not been disarmed after Aristide was returned in 1994, and he abolished the military. They began to regroup in the Dominican Republic, the neighboring Dominican Republic. Remember, it's the island of Hispaniola, which Haiti and the Dominican Republic share. They had been attacking from their safe havens in the Dominican Republic since 2002. These paramilitary forces of death squads and former military had been coming over from the Dominican Republic, going into townships in neighboring Haiti and killing Lavalas officials and their families. More than 70 Lavalas officials were killed between 2002 and 2004. And the Aristide government was protesting it, and the media was basically ignoring them. They were screaming to the wind. Look at these guys are in the Dominican Republic, and they're preparing an invasion. They're preparing a coup d'etat, and nobody would listen. Well, in February of 2004, after there had been built this so-called opposition movement to Aristide, and that's a longer, more detailed story of how they manipulated that, because I believe it was very much a manipulation, having lived there through that period of time. These same paramilitary forces came over from the Dominican Republic and started actually taking over townships and holding territory. Well, overnight, those same media that had been ignoring Aristide screaming about these paramilitary forces attacking and killing Lavalas officials, suddenly there were large stipends, there were reporters and camera crews sent to interview the quote-unquote rebels who were trying to overthrow Aristide. When they'd been there, of course, for 2 years previously, and they were being ignored when Aristide was bringing them to the attention of the media. Suddenly, these guys are falling all over themselves because this is a sexy story.
Well, some people say the media is totally corrupt, too, so they do what they're told.
I wouldn't say totally corrupt, but I'd say that a strong case can be made that the corporate media, and certainly state-sponsored media like the CBC, get it wrong most of the time.
Yeah. So why, again, why is it important to Canada, the United States, and France that Aristide be removed?
Well, Aristide represented independence. Aristide represented not playing the game of neoliberal economics.
Corporate economics.
Well, it's very specific. When you talk about the International Monetary Fund and you talk about the World Bank, you talk about neoliberal economics. And what that means is that you cannot invest in social programs. Aristide had invested in a universal literacy program where every adult between the age of 30 to 60 could go to a free literacy class. He had created what were called the Alpha Restos, which was a system of basically meals for the poor. The poorest of the poor were for an adoquin, 5 gourds, 5 gourds, about 18 cents. You could get a huge meal.
But this sounds good.
Well, of course it's good, but the point is that under neoliberal economics,
you can't do this.
You can't do this.
So this is part of the reason
You don't take money from your telephone company, and you don't take money from your electrical company, and you don't reinvest it into literacy programs. You're supposed to take the telephone company and the electric company, and you're supposed to put it out on the auction block to the highest bidder, which Aristide refused to do. You're supposed to privatize.
So that's part of the reason why somebody like him has to be removed.
That, but also, again, you know, there has never been an independent leader in the history of Latin America and the Caribbean that has ever been tolerated by the United States government. Whether you go back to the example of Jacobo Arbenz and the CIA engineered coup against him in 1954, popular, democratically elected government, president, in Guatemala, overthrown by the CIA, Juan Bosch in the Dominican Republic in 1965, Salvador Allende in Chile in 1973, the overthrow of Aristide in 2004, the attempted overthrow of Chavez before that, and the current efforts of the U.S. government, along with the Canadian government again, to destabilize the democratically elected government of Hugo Chavez. Independence, any line, independent political line, that is more beholden to the interests of their own local people than it is to the interests of U.S. foreign policy will not, has not ever been tolerated in this hemisphere. And Jean-Bertrand Aristide was extremely independent by the standards, by the yardstick put forth by the U.S. Embassy in Haiti. He did not fit the bill of a leader who would play ball with them, and therefore had to go.
And so Canada is part of this game?
Definitely. You can't, at this point, you cannot talk about U.S. foreign policy in the world without talking about Canadian foreign policy, because they are virtually inseparable.